Hello and welcome back. This is the week 10 lecture. So, this week we're going to cover a couple of additional strategies, a couple of different writing genres or methods of development. We can call them different things, but the point is we're going to add a few more skills to go along with the comparing and contrasting that we did last week. So kind of looking ahead just for a moment to Essay 3. I know we might not be ready to really think about Essay 3 yet, but we're going to be combining a lot of different styles or genres in our next major essay. So in a general sense, it will be a comparison and contrast essay, but we're also going to incorporate the things that we're doing this week. So that means examples and definition. And I'm going to cover both of those concepts here today. We are looking at both of them here in week 10. Next week, in week 11, we're going to spend at least the first half of the week looking at classification. And I will talk about that in my week 11 lecture. But then, of course, we will soon turn our attention to Essay 3 later in the week, and we'll start working on it throughout week 11. So that's just a kind of look ahead to see what we're doing both this week and next to get ready for Essay 3. So hopefully you've already taken a look at the overview and the week 10 module, so you know that we're talking about examples and definitions. These are pretty familiar concepts to most of us, much like narrative, much like description and comparison. All of these different writing styles should be at least somewhat familiar to us, even if we haven't used a lot of these styles in writing. We use them in everyday life all the time. So let's just start with examples. I want to go over some key definitions. We'll talk about examples of examples, and then we'll move on to definition and do the same for that. So just the basic thing to kind of understand, the basic definition that you need to have in mind for an example is that examples are specific occurrences or events that can be used to represent more general concepts or sort of more broad, often difficult to understand ideas. So examples help us to break down and explain broad, general ideas or concepts or groups. Examples are a way for us to better understand those broad, general concepts and ideas. So by using examples, we can break something big down into smaller elements because the specific examples are usually smaller, easier to digest, and they help us to understand the larger thing. So they are representing, examples are individual representations of some larger, more broad idea or concept. So we use examples all the time, both in everyday speech and, of course, we'll be using them in writing as well. And we use them so much, they're so familiar to us that we often don't even really think about what we are doing. But for almost any general statement that you want to make or any general concept that you want to explain, you're going to need examples. So, for example, if you make the following general statement about a friend of yours, he is a very reckless person. Okay, let's say you are talking about this friend with another friend or a family member who knows him. Okay, you make that general statement. The next step is to offer some examples. If you want to prove your general statement, or if you want people to better understand or believe your general statement, you need to offer specific examples of reckless behavior. He wrecked his car last year. He got arrested last month, etc., etc. If you offer specific examples, then your general statement, he is a reckless person, becomes easy to understand, it becomes easy to see, and the person listening to you will probably accept it. So again, examples represent the larger statement or the larger concept under discussion, but they can also help to prove it. They can also help to establish it as probably true. So when we turn our attention later in the semester to our argumentative writing techniques and we start working on argumentative papers, we're going to need to come back to examples, because when we're making arguments, examples are a really helpful form of evidence that we need to use. So the stuff that we're learning now will not only help us right now and in the couple of weeks to come as we get ready for Essay 3, this will also help us later on. So again, if you make a general claim or statement to a friend like, my team is better than your team, if we're talking about sports, again, you're going to need to offer examples, specific examples. I will need to do that in this imaginary scenario. So if I'm saying that my team is better, I need to provide examples of my team winning more games, examples of my team beating my friend's team in head-to-head matchups, or I need to provide other examples that offer reasons why my team is better. And we know this. We do this all the time in conversation. We can't just make general statements without offering examples to support them. This is kind of a basic argumentative structure that all humans kind of master really without the aid of school. We just kind of learn how to do this because it's a very natural part of interaction and communication. So a couple of other things just that I included in the Week 10 overview. Just be aware of the sort of distinctions between an extended example versus offering multiple examples. So in some cases, you might want to use an extended example to help you prove some larger statement or to illustrate or represent some larger concept. That extended example might go on for an entire paragraph. It might even take up multiple paragraphs. Oftentimes, we call extended examples anecdotes. Often these will take the form of stories, sort of brief narratives that serve as extended examples. And they might be based on an individual's personal experience. And again, they'll take the form of a story, a relatively brief story, but it has some kind of point. And the point is generally to prove the larger statement or the larger concept. So this is a big, long, detailed example. That's one way to go. You can also have several shorter, smaller examples that do sort of the same stuff, but instead of having one extended example that tells a brief story illustrating or representing the larger statement or concept that you are discussing or explaining or arguing for, you can instead offer maybe 3 or 4 brief examples in order to accomplish that same goal. It just depends on the organizational plan that you want to use. So again, we can just kind of do some easy practice with this. I mean, just a really easy general statement or concept such as the coronavirus has disrupted many aspects of life, society. Something like that. It'd be easy to offer a lot of specific examples that could go along with that general statement. And you guys can do this. I don't need to help you with this, right? There are a lot of different ways that the virus has disrupted everyday life. So we can talk about not going to school. We can talk about wearing masks in public. We can talk about social distancing. We can talk about events being canceled. We can talk about travel restrictions, whatever we want. So we can offer a series of examples that serve to illustrate or prove that general statement. So each individual example is an occurrence or an event or some kind of representation of the larger thing that we are talking about. So obviously, when we're discussing, when we're explaining, and when we're arguing, examples are very helpful tools that can help us. So as helpful things tend to do. So if you look at the Week 10 module, check out the video. I posted a couple of videos recently, so check out the video on the 3 laws of motion. When you're thinking about examples, again, I just wanted to give you an easy example of examples. So basically, we have this sort of abstract concept or a large, sort of difficult to understand concept, at least for non-science people like me, the 3 laws of motion. So they walk us through each one of those laws, and then they provide examples of each one. That is typically a good way to explain something that's difficult or maybe not common knowledge. So again, examples can help us with any kind of statement or concept, any kind of broad or general statement or concept, but especially if these concepts or statements are kind of abstract. If we're talking about things that we can't necessarily pick up and hold and describe and examine. So I'm thinking about concepts like love, loyalty, integrity, or in some cases even scientific concepts like the 3 laws of motion. These aren't necessarily these aren't like physical objects, or these aren't things that are sort of clearly true, such as the coronavirus has disrupted all aspects of human life. These are things that are a little bit more difficult to wrap our minds around. We can't pick them up and hold them. We can't automatically see them and understand them. So examples are especially important when it comes to concepts and statements like those. If I'm trying to explain love as a concept, I'm going to need to offer examples because there are different types of love. And it's kind of a difficult concept to explain without examples. I need to offer examples of love, marital love, familial love, all the different forms, what they look like. It's the same for any abstract quality that's really more of an idea. It's not something that we can pick up and hold. So when we're dealing with the abstract, examples are especially important. Just keep that in mind. So that might be important for us next week as we get into Essay 3 as well, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so I want to move along now to definition, and this is another style or technique that we are already familiar with. I don't need to explain to you guys what definitions are. We know. So this is a technique that we can use for a lot of things, and we can use it to sort of set boundaries around concepts or things, emotions, values. We use definition to really sort of clarify meaning. We're clarifying or establishing the meaning of particular words, obviously, but we can also use definition to help us explain complex processes or difficult concepts, abstract concepts, much like examples can. So again, going back to the process analysis, a lot of you needed to use definition at least a little bit in that assignment. And we talked a little bit about the need to define certain terms or even certain equipment or words, specialized words that might not be familiar to all of your readers. So if you were working within kind of a specialized area of knowledge, in some cases, you might need to define what certain words mean. There might have been some jargon that you had to explain to readers. There might have been specialized equipment or other things that you had to provide definitions for. So we've already perhaps seen, some of us at least, have seen how definitions come in handy when we're trying to explain complex processes or sort of difficult to understand concepts. So I want you to understand today the differences between formal definitions and what we call stipulative definitions. So I have definitions of those two types of definitions provided for you in the Week 10 overview. But let's just sort of talk about them a little bit right now. So the formal definition refers to the dictionary definition of a particular word. So we already are familiar with what these look like. With these, you will generally find a lot of information, a lot of good information, but one thing you'll notice with formal sort of dictionary definitions is that you often will sort of start with the general class that a particular word belongs to. So for example, if we're learning the formal definition of the word submarine, we might notice that it belongs to a general class of sea-going vessels. Okay, that is the large sort of category to which submarines belong. But as we know, there are a lot of different types of sea-going vessels. There are yachts, there are fishing boats. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that, go into the sea. So we have to then make a distinction between a submarine and the other members of its general class or category. So in this case, the distinction would be that submarines go underwater and most of those other seagoing vessels don't. So that's often kind of a starting place for a formal definition. We put a word inside a general group or category, and then we make a distinction between our individual word and all the other members of that group or category. And that distinction helps us to better understand our word, our particular concept that we are looking up. So if you go into the overview, you'll notice that I've kind of given you an example of a formal definition. In this case, it's for the word ephemeral. So I've just kind of recreated a lot of the info that you would find in a dictionary if you looked up the word ephemeral. So we learned that it is an adjective, that is the type of speech that it is. We could also think of that as kind of the category to which the word belongs. And we see just some basic info. The word means lasting for a short period of time. Okay, so that would be what we would consider as the formal sort of textbook dictionary definition of the word. Something that lasts for a very short time. But notice a few other helpful pieces of info that formal definitions often include that will help us to arrive at kind of a better understanding of the word. So we see some synonyms, right? Other words that are similar, that have similar meanings to ephemeral. So we see words like transitory, transient, fleeting, passing, temporary, short-lived. So a lot of these words are more familiar to us perhaps than the word ephemeral, which is not used all that often. It's not a part of a lot of people's vocabulary, but we all know what temporary means. We all know what passing means or short-lived, right? So those are more familiar words that will help us to remember what ephemeral means if we can compare ephemeral to these synonyms. And then we see some examples, perhaps, of things that are ephemeral, things that are short-lived, things that are transitory. So the mayfly is one example that I've seen before. That's just like an insect that only lives for a few hours. So obviously the lifespan of a mayfly is very ephemeral. And also I've seen the example of ephemeral rivers. These are sort of temporary, not permanent, rivers that are formed by like heavy rainfall or snow melt. So the rivers only exist at certain times and then they go away after a relatively short period of time. So again, thinking about examples of the larger concept or term will help us to better understand the concept or term. What I was talking about earlier, we see it play out right here with this particular word. You might also see the etymology of a word. That means the history of the word. Where did it come from? English is a really interesting language because it's kind of a hybrid language. It's Germanic in terms of grammatical structure, but we've borrowed a lot of words from other languages. So a lot of words have interesting histories. We've borrowed a lot of words from French. Some words we might be able to track their origins back to Latin or some other sort of bygone language or place or time. So the etymology is the history of the word, how the word developed. So you might be able to find some of that information. So a lot of cool stuff. You can learn the history of the word. You can find synonyms for the word. You can find examples of the word sort of in the world. And this is all helping us to better understand. So that's great. But formal definitions only get us so far. They're obviously helpful, but they're often going to be sort of a springboard for us because it's easy to look up the definition of a word. In my day, before the internet was so widespread, we actually had to use dictionaries, books. Now you guys can just go to Google, type in virtually any word in the English language, or any language really, but obviously we're dealing with English. You can type in any word and find the definition within seconds. So this is easy enough to do, but what I want you guys to understand is that formal definitions can serve as a springboard for a more lengthy, detailed exploration of a word or concept. So we don't really stop with the formal definition. We're going to sort of go beyond the formal, and we might want to do more with a word. And sometimes the formal definition does not fully capture all the different possible meanings and uses of a word. So I'll give you an example. If you look up the word pride, one of the first things you might see is a sense of self-respect. That could be considered a formal definition of the word. But as we know, sometimes pride can be used in a more negative way. If you think about an earlier concept I introduced, connotations. We talked about this back with narrative and description, the difference between denotation, which just means dictionary definition, and then connotation with a C. Connotation means the associations that we have with a word. So maybe the formal definition of the word pride is a sense of self-respect, but there can also be a negative connotation associated with the word if we're thinking about it kind of in the biblical sense, right? The pride comes before the fall. Sometimes pride's a bad thing. Excessive pride can be a bad thing. So sometimes connotations, the associations that we have with the word, the way a particular word makes us think or feel, they might be different than the actual formal definitions of a word. So that brings us to the next key term for us, which is stipulative definitions. And I've explained what that means in the overview. With stipulative definitions, we are demanding or specifying a particular use or a particular angle for a word or concept. So basically, as a writer, we are using this word in a particular way. We're not completely changing the meaning. It's not like we have to reject the formal definition. We don't have to ignore it. We don't have to change it. But with a stipulative definition, we're getting more specific. To stipulate something means to specify or demand. So that's what we're doing. We're specifying a very particular meaning of a word that might be unique to us, and it suits our larger purposes as writers. So again, we're not really changing anything. We're just getting more specific. We're using the word in a more specific, particular, perhaps even more personal way. Because one thing you'll notice with formal definitions, they're very impersonal. They're not specific to any situation or person. These are broad definitions, and there's a lot of room within them for us to kind of put our own unique stamp on a word. So, for example, going back to the word ephemeral, we've already seen the formal definition of that word, but let's say that I want to use ephemeral in a particular way. I'm writing a narrative about my childhood, just for an example, and I am considering my childhood to be ephemeral because looking back on it from the perspective of an adult, it seems like it was very short-lived. It seems like it was very temporary. It passed very quickly. So I'm going to use this particular adjective to describe an entire period of my life. Okay, and that's going to be an opportunity for me to describe and explain and tell a story or whatever. So I'm using a very sort of particular use of the word. I'm sort of putting it in a particular frame that will suit my individual purposes as a writer. So, but notice, I'm not changing the definition. I mean, again, the way I'm using the word is similar to what we saw in the formal definition. But in that formal definition, nobody said anything about me. nobody said anything about my childhood, right? So I'm taking this general concept or this general word, and I'm creating sort of my own unique framework, my own sort of personal definition that's very much based on the formal definition. But I'm taking something broad and general and impersonal, and I'm making it specific to me. And I'm making it specific to my purposes as a writer. So that's the difference. I hope that makes sense. So with stipulative definitions, we have a little bit of leeway. Again, we don't want to completely change the meaning of a word, but we're making a word or a concept more specific. And we're making it serve our larger purposes, whatever those purposes happen to be. So hopefully that makes sense, and we can kind of look at some actual practical ways to do this next week as we get moving on Essay 3. But also remember that there is such a thing as an extended definition as well, which will be longer and even more detailed than what we've been looking at so far. And again, the purpose is the same, right? We're trying to explore or better understand a thing, a concept, a word. And again, we're drawing boundaries around it. We're seeing what it's not. A lot of definitions might include negation. So like for ephemeral, not permanent, not long lasting. So we see synonyms, things that it's like. We see negation, what it's not like. We see etymology, the history of the word, if we're interested. We see what type of speech it is, right? What larger category it belongs to, right? So all of that's part of it. But when we're providing an extended definition, again, we can just kind of keep going. And this is especially important if we're dealing with things that are complex. Again, abstract, like I was talking about with examples. So just a few examples of things that would require extended definitions, maybe the writing process, because there are a lot of steps to it. So we could look it up, and maybe the formal definition that we could find would be relatively brief, straightforward, easy to understand. But again, the way I do the writing process is a little bit different than the way other people do it. So if I'm explaining my take on the writing process, I'm going to probably have to provide an extended definition of multiple steps, multiple phases, and I'm going to have to provide a lot of detail and information. Other things that are complex, difficult to understand, like an economic recession, right? If we're defining certain things about that, we're going to need an extended definition because it's not something we can do quickly or easily. So sometimes our definitions will be extended. I definitely want our definitions to be stipulative. I want us to use what we find in formal definitions and then kind of put our own spin on it, take that word and really bring it into our own world and find a specific use for it that's unique to us, that might rely on certain connotations. It might rely on certain aspects of the formal definition, but it might not be completely identical to that formal definition. So we're going to be creating stipulative definitions of our own, and in some cases we will have to do some extended definitions as well. So that's all I have for you, but check out the videos in the Week 10 module. The song, the music video that I posted is not completely connected to what I'm talking about here with definition, but the name of the song is Definition. And the guys in Black Star, the group there, if you actually look up the lyrics, and I would encourage you guys to look up the lyrics, there is some profanity, so if that's not your thing, maybe you want to skip the lyrics, but if you can either follow along by listening or look up the lyrics online, they are, if you notice, they're kind of trying to redefine certain things about hip-hop as a musical genre. So they're clearly not doing what we're doing, but they are kind of offering maybe an alternative definition, and they're making an argument that certain things are too common or prevalent in hip hop, and they want to kind of change the way maybe people understand this particular musical genre. So they are engaging in definition, and I think they also offer examples as well. So it's just a good song, but it does give you a chance to think a little bit more about definition, and then check out the science video when you're thinking more about examples. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week, I'll talk a little bit about classification. That's our final writing skill that we need for Essay 3. And then I'm going to transition into working on Essay 3. So I'll kind of have two parts to the Week 11 lecture. And I'll see you then.